I'm Dr. Benjamin Anderson. I'm one of the hospitalists here at Logansport Memorial Hospital, and the purpose of this talk is to just give some information about the COVID-19 vaccines. There's been a whole lot of information out there about them. There's also been a lot of misinformation, and I've had lots and lots of people ask me all kinds of questions, and I thought if I could get everything together in one place, hopefully it would help answer some of those questions. I do think it's important to mention that I'm not being paid by any of the vaccine companies. I'm not being paid anything extra to do this video. It's just an effort on my part to try to help get more information out there so that hopefully everybody gets as much accurate information as they can to make an informed decision about whether or not to get one of these vaccines. So some of the things we want to go over, how does the vaccine work? Is the vaccine safe? How effective is it? And then some of the common misconceptions regarding the vaccines. So first of all, how does the vaccine work? So there's three traditional types of vaccines that we've had. Those are live virus vaccines, killed virus, and subunit vaccines. And then there's some new vaccines that have come out specifically for COVID-19 that are called mRNA vaccines. So the live virus vaccines are some of the older ones we've had. We typically take a weakened form of a virus. And an example would be the polio vaccine, the MMR vaccine, or the smallpox vaccine. And historically, these have been some of our most effective vaccines. They're really able to get into the immune cells and activate the entire immune system to help it recognize the virus. To manufacture these vaccines, the virus has to be grown in living cells, and then it's placed in the vaccine. So this can be a somewhat slow process because you have to grow the virus. So we also have killed virus vaccines. They use a dead virus. Examples would be the pertussis vaccine and some of the influenza vaccines. And theoretically, these are safer because they don't use an actual live virus, but they haven't been as effective because the virus can't replicate in your immune cells, so the immune system is not fully activated. Typically, only the antibody response is what's activated. These also take time to manufacture as the virus has to be grown and then deactivated before it's incorporated into the vaccine. And then finally, there's subunit vaccines where you take a component of a virus or bacteria that the immune system can recognize, and then that's put in the vaccine. And some examples of that would be the diphtheria vaccines, tetanus, and the pneumonia vaccines. So how effective those are really depends on how strongly the component triggers the immune system. These also, they take quite a bit of time to manufacture as the virus or the bacteria has to be grown, and then you isolate that component and then incorporate that into the vaccine. So mRNA vaccines, these are the new vaccines that have been developed specifically for COVID-19. So what are they? So mRNA, it stands for messenger ribonucleic acid. Our bodies use mRNA to tell our cells what types of proteins to produce. And the mRNA vaccines, they allow a small strand of mRNA to be taken up by our immune cells, and then it tells our cells to produce a particular protein on the virus that our immune system can recognize. In this case, for COVID-19, it tells our bodies to produce the spike protein. These can be manufactured much, much faster because they don't depend on growing the virus in any sort of cells. It's just a synthesized strand of RNA that tells our bodies to make that particular protein. So everyone's probably seen this picture. It's been one of the most common pictures on the internet in regard to COVID. So this is a picture of COVID-19, and all those little red spots, that would be the spike protein. So that's what the mRNA vaccines are trying to tell our bodies to produce so our immune system can recognize and destroy the virus. So think of it a little bit like a game show where you're trying to get somebody to recognize which band made a certain music album. The entire music album would be like the whole virus, and you don't want to play the whole thing, you just want to play one song. So instead of putting the whole CD into your computer to play, you pick the most popular, recognizable song and you put that on a USB stick, you put that in your computer and have the computer play only that. So it's a lot safer because you're never exposed to the whole virus. It's faster because you don't have to grow the whole virus, and it can be comparatively cheaper as well. So the question is, if the mRNA vaccines are so great, how come we've never had one before? So the idea for mRNA vaccines actually it first began in the 1990s. But there were a lot of significant technical challenges to it. mRNA is extremely fragile. It cannot survive very long if it's floating freely in the body. So it has to be incorporated into something called liposomes. These are basically like little fat droplets. And so once in vaccine form, to maintain stability within the liposomes, it has to be kept at extremely cold temperatures, like negative 70 degrees Celsius. So the fat droplets are kind of like butter. They're quite hard if they're in the freezer, but once they're out, then if they're out for very long, it gets soft, unstable, and then the mRNA would be destroyed. So up until this point, there's really not been any strong motivation to produce a vaccine that has to be stored at such extremely cold temperatures. Many hospitals don't have a freezer that's cold enough to store it, and this makes distribution to remote areas and third world countries nearly impossible. It really wasn't until COVID took over the world that there was sufficient motivation to accept the logistical challenges of cold storage for these vaccines. So, is the vaccine safe? So just a couple of slides to talk about the background of these vaccine trials. So for the Pfizer vaccine, it began randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials on human trials on July 27th, 2020. They enrolled about 44,000 people in their trial. 8 of the people who received the vaccine developed COVID after they had been immunized, and then in the placebo group, about 162 people developed the virus, or were infected with the virus, and so there was about a 95% efficacy. The vaccine for Pfizer, it's a 2-step process. It requires a second injection 21 days after the first injection, and then it's 7 days after that people were found to have the most effective immunity, so about a month after your first dose. The Moderna vaccine was fairly similar. There were about 30,000 people in their trial. 5 people developed COVID-19 after immunization. None of those were severe cases. There were 90 infections in the placebo group. It gave them a 94.5% efficacy, so very, very similar. Moderna also is similar in that you get your first dose, and then 28 days later you get your next dose, and then it's about a week after that you're felt to have the strongest immunity. So in terms of safety, what are the symptoms that people might experience with these vaccines? So the truth is that there are going to be symptoms for a lot of people. They found that the symptoms were definitely a lot worse after the second dose, and the most common symptoms that people experienced were headaches, fevers, and body aches. I can tell you from getting the vaccine myself after the second dose, I had a low-grade fever, had some body aches. In most people, it lasts about 24 to 48 hours. Most people, the symptoms are relatively mild, but there will be symptoms in a lot of people. The most severe reaction that we've had is some allergic reactions. There have been some cases of severe allergic reactions to the vaccines, but these are primarily in people who have a history of very severe allergic reactions. That's why we monitor all patients for 15 minutes after they received the vaccine to watch for any sort of allergic reaction. So from the early data that we've had so far since we started vaccinating people, in regard to the Pfizer vaccine, there were 1,893,360 people who were vaccinated, and 21 cases of anaphylaxis occurred after that administration. So that's about 11.1 incidents of anaphylaxis per 1 million doses given. The vast majority of these occurred in the first 15 minutes after vaccination. Similar with the Moderna vaccine, they did over 4 million vaccinations, and they had 10 cases of anaphylaxis. 9 of those occurred in the first 15 minutes. So when the Moderna vaccine, that was about 2.5 cases per million doses given. So that is a serious reaction, but I would want to point out that none of those people died. There were no anaphylaxis-related deaths. And it is relatively rare, with anywhere from 2.5 to 11 cases per million. That's, in the overall, scheme of things for medicine, that's relatively safe. So how effective is it? So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, they're both around 95% effective. So we are not using the AstraZeneca vaccine that was developed in Oxford that is starting to be used at different places around the world. That's about 90% effective. Johnson & Johnson is also developing a vaccine. It's going to be a single-shot vaccine, which is good, but so far it looks like it's only going to be around 66% effective. So I want to go through some common objections that I've heard in regard to the COVID vaccine because, like I said earlier, I do think there's a lot of misinformation out there in regard to it. So the first question is, can I get COVID-19 from the vaccine? And the answer is no. The vaccines do not use the coronavirus itself to deliver the vaccine, so you cannot get COVID from it. The fevers, the body aches that people experience, this is your immune system turning on, learning to recognize the virus, but it is not the virus itself. So a question, isn't it better to get natural immunity? A lot of people ask that question. So natural immunity is typically strong, but it requires that you get infected. And unfortunately, at this point, there's no clear evidence for long-term immunity after infection. What we do know is that some people can get reinfected. There have been several cases where people have gotten reinfected, and in some of these cases, the second infection has been more severe than the first. So, the question, didn't they rush this? How can it be safe if we made a vaccine so quickly? So as I said before, mRNA vaccine technology, it's been in the works for 30 years. The storage issue has been probably the biggest hurdle that manufacturers were not willing to deal with until now. mRNA vaccines, they're a different technology, so they can be developed a lot faster than traditional vaccines because they don't have to grow that virus. So they can actually be done a lot quicker. But I think probably the biggest reason that we were able to make a vaccine so quickly is because the whole world has been working on this nonstop. Instead of having two guys work on a vaccine for 10 years, this has been a situation where you've had everyone pouring all their time and energy into this to try to get a vaccine out to the public. So, will the COVID-19 vaccine alter your DNA? So mRNA vaccines will not do that. They send a one-time message to your cells to make a certain protein, and then the mRNA is destroyed. It does not affect the DNA. It's sort of like the message in Mission Impossible. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, and then the message gets destroyed. So, is Bill Gates putting microchips in the vaccine? So this has been something that I've seen on the internet where people have a lot of concern about this. And it seems kind of out there, but there's always a kind of a nugget of truth into some of this stuff. And so when I went back and looked at this, the Gates Foundation, they had previously funded a study that looked at using a special kind of ink that could store a person's record of which vaccinations they'd received, sort of like a tattoo. This was an investigational thing, and it was never used in any vaccine to this point. This was primarily intended for developing countries where they didn't have the healthcare infrastructure to track which vaccines people had received. And so that was the idea that if you just tie it to the vaccine itself, you'd be able to know what people had been vaccinated with. But again, this is not something that has been used on any vaccine at this point. The Gates Foundation did not fund either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine did receive some funding from the German government, and the US government helped to fund the Moderna vaccine through Operation Warp Speed. Incidentally, Dolly Parton gave about $1 million to the funding for the Moderna vaccine, but as far as I know, I don't think anybody's been worried about Dolly Parton having any nefarious plans for the public. So, are the vaccines made using aborted babies? So with the development of some vaccines in the 1960s, there were cell lines that were developed using 2 aborted babies. Those cells were used to grow the weakened viruses that could later be used in some of the vaccines. mRNA vaccines completely avoid the need to grow viruses in human cells. They do not need to use any human cells, aborted or otherwise, in the manufacturing process. So, will the vaccine make me infertile? This is another rumor that's been going around on the internet, that the vaccines attack a protein called syncytin-1. And syncytin-1 is a protein that's necessary for the placenta to remain attached to the uterus. And because it's similar in makeup to the COVID spike protein, there has been concern that it would attack the syncytin-1. So the spike protein and syncytin-1 do share some of the same amino acids, but they're not at all the same protein, and there's no evidence that the immune system would treat them similarly. It's sort of like saying that mashed potatoes taste like chocolate chip cookies because they both have butter in the recipe. It's a similar component, but the end result is radically different. And incidentally, 23 women so far who were in the Pfizer vaccine trial have already become pregnant. So there's really just no evidence for this. So does a person need to be vaccinated if they've already had COVID? So again, there's no clear evidence for how long people are going to retain their immunity after having COVID. At this point, it appears the immunity will last at least 3 months after infection, likely more than that, but we're not completely sure. One thing we do know is that people have been reinfected, and in some cases, as I said before, the second infection has been worse than the first. So currently, it's recommended that previously infected people go ahead and get the vaccine if it's been more than 90 days since they were infected. One of the other things of concern is that there's been a number of mutations that have occurred leading to different forms of the virus. So far, there's been about 4,000 variants that have been identified throughout the world. It looks like right now the vaccine is going to be effective against most of these mutations, but that certainly may change. There's a variant in South Africa that's been in the news, and there's certainly some concern that the vaccines are not going to be as effective against that. I have every expectation that the virus is going to continue to mutate, and we're going to have to adapt to that with our vaccines as well. Moderna is already working on a booster for their vaccine that'll target some of these mutations if it becomes necessary. So somebody who has had COVID already, it's certainly possible that there could be new strains that come out that you would be exposed to that you could get just as sick with because your body won't know how to recognize it because of the mutations. So after being vaccinated, do you still need to wear a mask and practice social distancing? So the current vaccines we have, they're anywhere from 66% to 95% effective, but that's not 100%. So there are some people who are going to get vaccinated who may still be at risk to get the virus. Also, not everybody is going to be able or willing to take the vaccine. People who have had a history of anaphylaxis, they may not want to get the vaccine, and some people, it may not be something that they should get if they have had a strong history of severe allergic reactions. So there's going to be some people, for one reason or another, they're not going to be able to do it. And so, it may also still be possible to spread COVID even though you've been vaccinated. You may not get sick with it, but it may still be in your system that you could spread. So the safest choice at this point is to continue to be cautious until our rates of infection fall further. When there's so much out there in the community, the risks are still so much higher that continued mask wearing and social distancing is going to be important until we get more people vaccinated. So why I got the vaccine. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I did get the vaccine. I was the first person here at the hospital to receive the vaccine. I did volunteer to do that. So just some statistics that are up to date as of this week. We've had, in the United States, we've had over 26 million cases. We've had over 447,000 deaths in the United States. So COVID-19 is surpassed cancer and heart disease as the leading cause of death in the United States. Here in Cass County, we've had over 5,000 cases. We've had over 65 deaths. We've had over 200 patients from our community that have required hospitalization here at our hospital. And I'm sure that there's a lot more than that who have been hospitalized at other places as well. So COVID is a very bad disease. I've seen it up close. I've been watching this disease. I've been watching people get sick with it. I've been watching people die with it since end of last March and first of last April. So the mortality rates, they're concerning. That's what everybody talks about, but they really leave out a number of people who survive but still have significant injury. The mortality rates are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how damaging this virus can be. I've seen multiple patients who have had strokes, they've had blood clots, they've had severe lung damage that's likely to be permanent. I've had a lot of people who have had to go home on oxygen who may never get off. Right now, again, as I've said, there's no convincing evidence that you can't be reinfected after you've had COVID. And all the evidence we have so far is that some people can get reinfected. And again, as the virus mutates, I think it's going to be more and more likely that people can get reinfected. So we also don't fully know the long-term effects of this disease. From what I have seen to this point, I'm not convinced that an asymptomatic infection is a completely benign infection. I think that there are going to be side effects that we see that are going to be related to this that are going to manifest themselves down the road. And certainly there's a lot of patients who may have had COVID, they may have recovered, but they've not recovered all the way, and they still have lingering side effects for months afterwards. And for all of those reasons, I think it's so important to prevent getting the virus in the first place. So this is a picture that I wanted to show. This is a CT scan of a COVID patient's lungs. And lungs on a CT, they really should look dark. So the dark areas are healthy lungs. The white areas, the kind of patchy white areas, that's COVID-19. And this is kind of a progression, as you can see, as it gets more and more throughout the lungs. And then here at the bottom, you can see where it's really just taking over the lungs. So I've heard a lot of people talk about COVID-19 as kind of a bad flu. I've seen influenza do this in a person's lungs maybe one 1 to 2 times throughout my career, certainly less than 5. It has not been a very common thing. Basically, every patient that we admit to the hospital has this in their lungs. This is what their lungs look like. This is a devastating disease. And this is not just what's happening in the lungs. This is happening throughout the body. We just see it the most in the lungs. But this is a systemic disease, and it causes damage throughout the whole body. So, again, why did I get the vaccine? I truly believe that the science is sound. I think that this vaccine, it was well researched. I think it was well developed. I think that it is a safe vaccine. It doesn't mean it's without risk, but I think overall it's a very safe thing. One of the examples I've used in several people when they ask me about this, I say over the course of my career, the single drug that I've seen more people die from than any other drug, it's been ibuprofen. It's been something that can cause ulcers in the stomach. People can have bleeding, or it can shut the kidneys down. I've seen that happen many times. And that's something that most of us, we don't think anything about. It's over the counter, and probably everybody watching this video has used ibuprofen. I've used it before as well, but I've seen a lot of people die from that. But we don't consider that to be as risky. Is there risk associated with the vaccine? Yes, but it's a very, very small risk. And overall, compared to other things we do in medicine, that risk is very minimal. And certainly the risk is much, much less than the risk from COVID. The other reason is that, this is the only way back to normal, in my opinion. None of the treatments that we have really work reliably well. People who get infected with COVID, there's some people, no matter what we do, they're going to die. And it has been just absolutely devastating to watch this in these patients. And, most things in medicine, if I can get to the diagnosis early enough, if I can get to the treatment early enough, they're going to do well. They're going to survive. They're going to go home. And COVID has not been that way. COVID, unfortunately, no matter what we throw at some people, they just don't survive. And the only way to prevent that is to prevent them from ever getting sick in the first place. And the only way we can do that is the vaccine. I've certainly seen too much death from this. I know all of my colleagues have seen too much of it. And I know everybody's tired. Everybody's tired of the masks and the restrictions and everything that has come along with this. But the vaccine is truly the best way forward, and it's the quickest way back to normal. So hopefully you find this information helpful. Certainly, if you have questions, I know that anybody here at the hospital, your primary care doctor, anybody would be happy to answer any questions that you do have. Hopefully, I've convinced some people, if you're sitting on the fence, that to go ahead and get the vaccine. But either way, I thank you for watching.